Welcome to the Depth Dialogues podcast,
where we explore how depth psychology is applied to tackle contemporary social issues.
I'm Kirk Schneider.
And I'm Tyler Gamlin. Okay, welcome back to Depth Dialogues. Today, I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Susan Rowland, a prominent scholar and thought leader in the fields of depth psychology and literary studies. As the associate chair of two hybrid programs at Pacifica Graduate Institute, the MA in Engaged Humanities and the Creative Life, and the PhD in Jungian and Archetypal Studies, Dr. Rowland plays a crucial role in shaping the next generation of thinkers and practitioners. With over 30 years of academic experience, she has authored 10 influential books that bridge Jungian theory with literary criticism, gender studies, and ecological awareness. Her latest work, The Ecocritical Psyche, explores the intricate relationship between Jungian symbols and our connection to the natural world, advocating for a more reciprocal understanding of humanity's place within it. Dr. Rowland's scholarship not only delves into Jung's insights on myth, technology, and the feminine, but also addresses the pressing psychological and ecological crises of our time. Dr. Rowland previously served as the professor of Jungian studies at the University of Greenwich in London and was the founding chair of the International Association of Jungian Studies. Currently, she is also a novelist, actively writing the Mary Wan Walker mystery series, where she intertwines her passions for detective fiction and depth psychology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Rowland to the Depth Dialogues podcast. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you.
Well, heartiest welcome, Susan. And it's great to have you here, in part because of your varied background, and it's a little bit of a different background than a number of the guests that we've had who have been more clinically focused. Your background is very broad-based, and my understanding it comes out of English literature and the literary understanding and sensibility of Jungian psychology, which is fascinating to me. I think to Tyler as well, many in our audience. So my first question is really an orienting one to try to get more of a sense of where you're coming from with this perspective. You appear to be applying what you call the lost feminine of modernity, as I understand it. You're attempting to restore that and to highlight that dimension on the contemporary scene in terms of a number of crises that we're facing today, including the ecological crisis and a recent book that you wrote about our enchantment with nuclear weaponry. So we would much appreciate it if you could elaborate on your impetus for moving in this direction with your work.
Thank you very much. Well, Jung said, one of my favorite quotes, "I am stuck," is the theme of fairy tales and myth, and it is what everybody says when they come into analysis. So that's, to me, is very important in the sense that he's talking about culture when he's talking about fairy tales and myth. And we know that Jung was a critic of culture throughout his life, and a lot of his collected works are devoted to various cultural topics. And then, of course, he's a clinician, and he founded and inspired a whole clinical area. So I am not a clinician, and I never pretend to be, and I never pretend to offer therapy or say that anything I do is instead of therapy. In a way, I'm speaking to those of us who can't afford therapy, and sort of carrying on Jung's perceptions. In terms of the feminine, I was drawn to study Jung's collected works as a literary production. And I felt that there was a drive in his work that was about restoring the feminine to modernity. That depth psychology as a whole arises out of the splitting of modernity, a splitting that had reached a crisis point in the end of the 19th century, but has even more of a crisis point today, when we can see that so many of our terrible problems are to do with being split, either as you know, Jung's focus was on the psychological split, but he knew perfectly well that the psychological split would be replicated in cultural splitting. So modernity has been distinguished by being split off from nature, by being psychologically split from the other, from the irrational. This has given rise to things like colonialism, and, you know, is actually very much embedded in capitalism. This idea that the world consists of objects that can be just manipulated and bought and sold. And if that goes to an extreme, then people get treated as if they can be bought and sold. And we know that that is a very terrible legacy of the modern world. So Jung, I think, intuited very deeply that what has been split must be brought back, must be brought in from the margins in order for psychic health, which he felt was very much to do with wholeness, and that this would or should happen at a collective level. When it came to gender, I think Jung had a lot of personal issues that made him quite frightened of the feminine. And it's rather amusing. He persists in his work in dividing the feminine from women. So he says things about women that are a bit silly and essentialist. But he repeats again and again that the feminine must be restored, that the anima must be restored. And partly in terms of the society he was living in, and partly, I think, in terms of his own issues, he saw the restoration of the feminine psychologically as about restoring the psyches of men, and that modernity was sick, men were sick, men need to be restored, and then things can just carry on as they have before. He wasn't a social revolutionary, but he was a revolutionary in the sense that he insisted on the necessity to rethink psychological being. And so his idea of individuation, which is developing a relationship with the psychological other, necessitated developing a relationship with the psychological other as gender, as well as developing a relationship with nature, as well as developing a relationship with the sacred. So there's this, what I've called the project in Jung to restore the feminine to modernity, where the feminine also stands for all the other things that Western modernity has repressed or marginalized, including the relationship with nature. And I suppose I grew up not only as a scholar, I grew up in feminist theory, and so I thought that this was fascinating, that really, on the one hand, Jung is a very profound feminist, and on the other hand, he really isn't. And so that was something that was worth exploring and writing about. And that something that was developed in literary studies known as close reading today, which is a way of reading very deeply and psychologically, although literary studies doesn't talk about the psyche, that this practice isn't that different from active imagination. It's not the same, because in literature, you are treating the literary text as other and as generative. And in Jungian psychology, you are focusing on the other as the psychic image. But that the practice of going very deeply and with, developing a skill at doing this, there are strong similarities between literary studies and Jungian practice. And, back when I began to sort of know a number of Jungian analysts, I was incredibly impressed by the way they could work with images. Obviously with patients, but also, in discussions and conferences and things. And that skill I kind of recognized from my own disciplinary studies. That then, after a number of years, led on to a discovery of transdisciplinarity as described by someone who was once a quantum physicist. His name is Basarab Niculescu. And his theorizing is an attempt to look at all these different disciplines and the difficulties they have of speaking to one another. But what does that mean for us as human beings? And can we, and one of the things that the splitting of modernity has done is split up knowledge into these different disciplines, which has profound consequences that are exacerbated by the disciplines being understood as a hierarchy. So we're in a culture that says certain types of knowledge are important and certain types of knowledge are not important. And that is part of the split that we all live with. A certain kind of science is important, but understanding of the arts is not important. It should be regarded as a luxury. But both of these understandings are vital for human development. And so how knowledge is organized is very important to how the psyche is being organized before someone gets into analysis. And this idea of transdisciplinarity is actually very Jungian. Jung intuited that there was something going on in different disciplines that needed to be joined up. And transdisciplinarity, as it's developed in the 21st century, is doing this. And I have a whole thing about Dionysius around this, but I think I've said enough.
Well,
and I'll let you ask me some more questions.
if you don't mind a follow-up question, you've said a lot and rich. And it actually seems to me to have resonance to some of the things Michel Foucault has said about how, powerful people have sort of taken over the structure of knowledge.
Yes.
For their own benefit.
Yes.
And for commercial and corporate benefit.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So that's an interesting connection. You said a lot about the sort of the feminist critique or the lost feminine critique of modernity, but I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about what is the lost feminine affirming. The sense that I get from what you're describing is that, and what Jung was trying to bring was to bring back almost a Neolithic era sense of the feminine to the degree we understand that era. some of the work of Maria Gimbutas, for example, and Rayan Eisler, who have talked about partnership societies,
Yeah.
so it's a more holistic vision, as I understand it. It holds the paradoxes, the contrasts, and the contradictions of our lives in a more coexisting and discovery-oriented way, rather than the splitting off. Is that where you're coming from?
Well, that's where I'm coming from. Yeah, I think I'm not sure about Neolithic. Jung was very aware of, I mean, Jung was a conservative with revolutionary ideas, so he wanted to restore the world that he felt had taken a wrong direction psychologically, and he was clearly very bound up with Christianity, and he tried to rethink Christianity that would remain Christianity while doing something about the splitting of gender in the Godhead. That, you know, that the Christian God was a big problem for Jung because he was identified with goodness alone and, you know, logos alone. And so there was a missing eros, missing connection, missing body, missing matter, and missing shadow. And so he writes Answer to Job, which is hilarious in parts. It really is Jung's comic novel, because he describes Yahweh as having two wives, having forgotten about one of them, but these two wives were important. And so we have, you know, Sophia comes back and all of this, as well as the devil, who is also, you know, the shadow of God. And then the shadow of God becomes manifest in modernity and nuclear weapons, he says at the end of that book. In terms, so I think throughout my career, there's been a sort of continued interest in this idea of the sacred feminine, that the sacred feminine exists in other religions. It may have existed in the distant past. It did exist in a more polytheistic past, and that, you know, Jung felt that the problem with that religion really ought to be organizing the psyche, the collective psyche, and it's not, or his Christianity had failed because it had been split off from the collective psyche because it wasn't whole enough. So he was trying to put bits back in. And I think it's worth remembering that he doesn't write very much about goddesses, but he does make a very interesting comment about synchronicity. When he describes synchronicity, he says that it allows nature to answer out of her fullness. And he is then describing nature as a kind of goddess. So there is this, how do you deal with gender and the sacred if you're coming out of a monotheistic culture? And I think that was a kind of continual struggle for him. Like many people today, I'm drawn to what little I know of Indigenous societies and how the sacred becomes part of the land and has many forms, some of them anthropomorphic and some of them not. And so in recent years, I've become interested in the European Indigenous, because of course I am of European descent. And so through my novels, I've been looking at the way in which the indigeneity of Europe in some ways persisted and still persists through modernity. So that there are sites, there are practices, there are relics of the ancient Celts, which were actually over all of Europe, not just Ireland. And they were the last peoples who were embedded in the land in an indigenous way and had their goddesses and gods. And that was part of how they lived together on the land.
Mhm, mhm. Oh, thank you. Tyler, did you have?
So much that comes up for me, especially in your first response a few minutes ago. So many themes that I picked up on. Martin Buber with I, thou, and I, it, and talking about relating to the world, and actually a lot of things that Kirk talks about quite a lot with this polarized mind and awe. I hope we can get into that a little bit, and this importance of myth that Rowland spoke about, and how that crosses cultures, and in a modern sense, we are missing that. I'm wondering if you can speak to any of those points in how your work relates to that further.
I think it's fascinating the way myth persists, and perhaps it persists in ways that aren't very healthy, or aren't sort of fully recognized for in the sense of psychological wholeness. So, for example, we don't really recognize the theory of evolution as a myth, but it is a theory that can't be proved in its entirety. And we're sort of told that it's the truth. But if we look at the theory of evolution, it's really the mother goddess. It hasn't changed at all. Whereas a different society believes that the earth is a goddess, and the goddess, gives birth to everything. So now we're told the earth gives birth to everything in its own complexity and processes. But we're also told that we are cut off from this idea of the goddess. We have to strip away the sacred, and yet we really ought to be much more respectful of the Earth's evolutionary processes. And we know that we're losing a lot of the fertility and generativity of the Earth through the climate emergency. So there's an awful sense of we've lost the myth, but we haven't lost the myth. And so what we tell ourselves is a kind of rational position on how humans got to be, for example, actually isn't a rational position, because it's a mixture of attitudes that have grown out of a monotheism that got skewed towards patriarchy in a very dominant way. And so Christianity developed this idea that the humans are stewards, as one version of the Bible has it, but that becomes humans as capitalists and the earth as resources. one of the things about America, for example, today is the notion that that there's a correlation between wealth and virtue, or a correlation between wealth and talent. That is a very American thing. And it comes from the religion of the colonists. So a lot of the colonists coming from Europe, and they were escaping religious persecution, and they had a Puritan version of religion. And part of that was this notion that money was a sign of God's approval. That if you made money, you were doing that because God approved of you. That it was a sign of your virtue and your, chances of getting into heaven. So that then becomes a myth of capitalism that has this distinct American flavor. And so it pushes us away from this notion of a reciprocal relationship with the earth.
Doesn't that, I'm sorry, doesn't that have its roots in Calvinism as well?
Yes, exactly. Exactly. But this idea of make money and it's a sign of God's favor.
Yeah.
That became very defining in America because Europe, that also had that religion, had so many other social structures, So, class and, all the other kind of social structures. Whereas America, starting from scratch. And so the idea of the American dream, which is so powerful, that it's probably incredibly powerful in the climate emergency, because it's this notion of destiny to it's individualism. It's this notion of, if I make loads of money, if I work hard, if I make loads of money, then I am, this is the best that I can do, that I am a good person because I've become a millionaire and recently a billionaire. And it's all about me. It's all about me. It doesn't matter if I cut down a forest to do it. In fact, that is a good thing, because this successful making of money is this is a guarantee of virtue. So people don't think of it in religious terms, but that structure of what is a good life and what you are supposed to do in your life, that has become very deeply embedded. And so people think the climate emergency is a luxury, that money is more important than clean air. Money is more important than food. Money is more important than the climate being able to grow food in the future. Money is more important than the coastal cities being inundated. Nothing is more important than money, because money has become a kind of God. And that is a very powerful myth.
Yeah.
And it's believed by pretty much everybody. As I say it, I partly believe it myself, and I have spent decades saying, no, no.
Yeah.
How do we push against that? How do we right the ship? Is it something that we can do? Because I see that influence from the West, worldwide, right? That's not just something that's here in America.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. I mean, it's very powerful in America, and in some ways, American culture has exported it. Well, let's talk about Dionysus, because there's a great essay by James Hillman, Dionysius in Jung's writing, and I think it's quite prophetic in many ways. Also, Jeanette Paris has done some fabulous work on Dionysus. She makes the point that Dionysus has to be worshipped collectively. So the point about these myths and gods, I guess, as I've been saying, is they don't go away, they change form. So we have Dionysus because Dionysus describes a certain type of energy. And it is an energy that breaks down barriers. So if we want to get rid of splits, we probably want some kind of Dionysus. But Dionysus is very unregulated. Dionysus is where human nature and nature, they kind of flow into each other, very kind of instinctual, bodily, and all the rest of it. Hillman says that to Jung, the importance of Dionysus was in being a god of dismembering, but also a god of remembering. And he goes on to point out that dismembering and remembering is a way of describing Jungian individuation, which I think is very helpful because people sometimes forget that individuation can be agonizing, can involve enormous suffering. Hillman then goes on to say that, or imply that Jung doesn't go far enough. And he talks about a second kind of dismembering that isn't putting back together again what is very like what was there before, but a dismembering of a body where you don't put the parts back together, but you bring them together so that they recognize each other as parts, and that this leads to a new instinctual consciousness. And this is, of course, Hillman presenting his version of archetypes as polytheism. And it's a nice expression of Hillman's relationship to Jung. Well, reading that, it begins to offer us all something. So Jeanette Paris reminds us that Dionysus can only be worshipped collectively. If you try and do Dionysus on your own, you end up like Pentheus, you end up, torn apart. And this is a way of understanding things like addiction. You try and do this, the ecstasies that are possible through alcohol. You try and do the ecstasies that are possible through potent drugs, and you're not going to be able to manage that. The only way to do alcohol and drugs is to do them in a way that is ritualized, and we have those kinds of rituals. So we can see Dionysus at work in the ways in which we are feeling helpless, if you like. I mean, the pandemic was very Dionysian. It tore apart a lot of structures, and we put them back together again, and we're still kind of feeling those effects. The way in which structures, international structures, have broken down or are threatened to break down, that is a very kind of Dionysian thing. The climate emergency is a very Dionysian thing, because that that relationship of domination with nature has which began in well, you could pull it back as far as you like, but that relationship of domination with nature has kind of broken down. The recent hurricane is an example of the fact that we can't control nature.
Postmodernism, another example, huh? Postmodernism.
Well,
breakdown of
Yeah,
tradition.
I can come back to postmodernism.
Okay.
My point is that Dionysus can only be worshipped collectively. So if there is to be a hope, then it does have to be collective. It has to be that the human energies become remembering enough, in both senses of remembering, that we can build something that can hold the powerful Dionysian energies of nature.
Can
I
you?
think there is hope, and I think also that no one person, definitely no one person, has the answer. But
Yes.
we do have the capacity to build something together. But it will take what it will take is it will take stopping marginalizing other kinds of society. So we have to start listening to all the other kinds of society in the world. That includes Eastern societies, but it particularly means Indigenous societies, because they do have a way of living with nature that is sustainable.
So I'm sorry, you're speaking to the practical application right now, or beginning to. So I'd like to explore that a little bit more with you. Can you give us examples of where this dismembering and remembering is now taking place at a collective level, and that maybe you're involved in, practically speaking, on the ground? Are like, where is the social healing taking place, and are you involved in that?
Well, there are, I think we can name efforts to heal the body politic and the body human. My first thought at your question is the whole practice of rewilding, which is, I mean, I hadn't heard the word 15 years ago, but now it's happening all over. We know what it is. We can kind of see the point of it. Somebody, I was at a meeting, a Zoom meeting at the weekend, and somebody gave an example of work being done on the west coast of America to restore the wild salmon. But what was really interesting about it was she said, well, they're restoring the salmon, but it's not about fishing the salmon, it's about helping the orca. So there's always been a lot of environmental work, and environmentalists are enormous heroes, and there has been in the education world a great reaching out and attempt to understand how nature works in a much more complex and reciprocal way. This has also happened in the humanities, where there is, again, an attempt to make the kinds of work done in the humanities important in terms of addressing how the far-reaching nature of the crises we're in. So a thing called eco-criticism started in the 1990s, and it was kind of like turning the Titanic on the way literary studies had looked at nature. Literature has always been about nature, but it's also always been about nature from that particular culture's point of view. Eco-criticism wanted to be critical about that in the cause of finding something better, and enormous amounts of work have been done. One of the things that I think is very useful is the novel as a form, because the novel is the attempt to ensoul the printing press. So we are rightly very worried about social media. Social media is very dangerous. It's a massive experiment on the human population of the planet. Oh, wouldn't this be a good idea? Let's do this.
Yeah.
And there was no thought. It was all about making money. Making money has to be a good thing. No one's going to stop me making, a few billion here and there on this social media thing. And yet now it influences elections and so on and so forth.
Just on that point, one of my favorite books is The Art of the Novel.
Yes.
Dara.
Yes, I know.
He really makes that point about bringing the spirit of complexity to our planet.
That is exactly it. So social media, there's always been forms of social media that in our Western culture have been kind of thrust on an unwitting population. And I think the printing press was one of them, because what happened when the printing press suddenly got invented was that the book that had been, kept in monasteries and, very carefully, suddenly the book was everywhere. And two things happened in that century of the printing press. One was the Reformation, which we tend to think of as a good thing, but actually led to wars all over, massive killings and burnings at the stake and wars throughout Europe. It was devastating. And the other thing was the persecution of witches, which came from a particular printed book. So these were terrible things because the psyche could not cope with, or both the collective psyche could not cope with the printing press until the novel was invented. And the novel was ensouled books, really. The novel, other books too, but I think the novel kind of was the most powerful in ensouling the book. And the novel was a very feminine invention because a lot of the early novelists were women, but all of the early novelists were looking at aspects of human interaction that had not been represented very much before.
Don Quixote.
Yeah, exactly. They were looking at, people's lives, what made them tick, and also their domestic lives and their relationships. Novels can have very masculine heroes, but they're always having to have relationships with other people. There's a wonderful essay by Ursula Le Guin called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, in which she argues that the novel is this a development of consciousness, of complexity, as you say, that has been consistently marginalized, but remains very important. So you asked me what I'm doing. Well, I'm writing novels where the triple goddess is the hero. So I wanted to kind of evoke the European Indigenous, the Celts, but my murder mysteries are set in the present day, and the detective is actually three women who are the triple goddess in a mythical sense, and they have to work together. They're very different women, but they have to learn to work together. And we've been talking about myth. Detective fiction is hugely mythical, hugely mythical. You can say it's about human sacrifice, at one level. But the kind of detective fiction I like is very much a kind of rethinking of the Holy Grail myth. So the Grail is the solution, and it's hard to find, and you have to ask the right questions, and you have to be the right person. And if you find the solution, the wasteland will be healed. Now, think how contemporary that is. You know, if there was a story about healing the wasteland or a myth about healing the wasteland, you'd think, oh, that must be a 21st century myth because that's the climate emergency. The climate emergency is the wasteland. So that myth is so relevant. And maybe if we can start thinking of the climate emergency as the wasteland that is not a necessary condition, but something that can be healed by the Holy Grail, then, you know, we might be able to find ways of coming together to constitute that Grail.
Yeah. I'd like to ask a very practical question in light of the fact that as we sit here now, Israel and Iran are lobbing missiles at each other. And of course, we have the whole blow up in Ukraine and Russia and many threatening military situations in our world today.
Yeah.
What do you have to say in terms of addressing some of these immediate dangers and the whole question of, it's almost a Machiavellian question of, should societies like ours have some degree of military power and ability to repel what we view as anti-democratic forces, autocratic, totalitarian forces? You know, does that not cross over to some degree to the lost feminine and protecting the lost feminine? How do you respond to that?
Well, I, as a person, do not have any special insight, nor do I have any special scholarly expertise. However, as somebody who teaches depth psychology, I should have something to say. One of the questions about the Holy Grail is, whom does the Grail serve? And I think that one of the questions about, shall we say, the two conflicts in Israel and Palestine and Lebanon, and Putin and Zelensky, is, what is the hurt? I mean, no war can stop before people think, well, how did we actually get here? With Putin seems to be working very hard to incarnate Pluto. And with Ukraine as his Persephone. And I think there's a lot of Pluto and Persephone about. That is that's a very stark thing. One of the things that's very moving about Ukraine is that Ukraine is the only country in the world that gave up its nuclear weapons. And, you know, they are now sorry that they gave up their nuclear weapons, and you can't blame them for that. But they did. And they've shown the Ukrainians have shown a willingness to die for the right to be Ukrainians. And that is something that we don't understand. but that we need to understand. And Putin is trying to incarnate a god, and that is not going to end well for him, but he's certainly inflicting a great deal of destruction in the meantime. Anybody who tries to incarnate a god is serious trouble, and I think we've got one of those much nearer to home. In terms of Israel, I want to ask, you know, that those people who are who approve of the current actions of Israel, what is your hurt? You know, what is it that has made what appears from the outside to be an aggression, for example, into to Lebanon? And it seems very clear to me that we're talking about the Holocaust. We're talking about the effects of the Holocaust on an entire people who were, you know, who knew in the most terrible way that the power around them wanted to completely extinguish their identity. So that is a hurt that I think has to be addressed by all of us. Because
I'm sorry, we're also talking about the re-traumatization of that
yeah,
with the slaughter of 1,200
oh,
Israelis.
absolutely. I'm not. That is exactly the case. That is exactly the case. And you know, you said, what about another country like America? Well, I think we have to kind of go back to the Second World War and look at what happened and who was involved, and all of the countries were involved. So, you know, my country of birth, Britain, was involved. And, you know, America was involved, and different things happened in relation to the suffering and persecution of the Jews.
So your recommendation is the need to face these hurts,
Yeah,
to work with them and
yeah,
work through them to the degree possible.
yeah.
I'm very involved in that, just quickly, as you may or may not know, with these bridge building dialogues between people who are of highly contrasting cultural and political backgrounds.
Yeah,
I'm fostering a one-on-one approach to those,
yeah.
called the experiential democracy dialogue. There are other grassroots groups like Braver Angels that are doing more group processes. Is this the kind of thing that you're advocating at a practical level as well, as meeting
Yes,
each other, facing and
it is. I mean,
countering
I have friends who have family on both sides, or all three sides of, you know, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine. And, you know, people from the UK don't know that the UK was very involved in how Israel was evolved. And we need to sort of know, we need to know the past, and we need to look at those hurts of the past. And also, but also to look at the hurts of the present.
I realize our time is waning, but Tyler, I want to give you a chance to follow up with any sort of concluding reflections or inquiries here.
Yeah, I think we've touched
So
on
much here.
some wonderful things. I wish we had more time. Yeah, Susan.
Well, I would like to mention Jungian arts-based research,
Yes,
Mhm.
but
because you have talked about practicalities, and Jungian arts-based research, in my view, is doing therapy with the collective.
Mhm.
So arts-based research was developed in the 1990s in America, and by people in education, and a particularly important scholar is Patricia Levy. And it was this realization that the psychic capacities that were being brought to scholarly research were very split. And, you know, research means in the intellect, and research means rationality, and, you know, that creativity has nothing to do with research, but creativity has so much to do with human beings. So there has developed this thing in universities called arts-based research. However, there has not been very much psychology in it, and there's been very little Jung in it. There is a particular Jungian who has done some really great work on arts-based research, and that's Sean McNiff. He's training clinicians. And when I came across all of this, I thought, aha, what about people who aren't going to be clinicians? And what about the way arts-based research uses Jungian identified important aspects of our being? Arts-based research uses the imagination, obviously, but it uses intuition. It uses the sensation feeling. It uses feeling as well as thinking. And if you have a Jungian frame, if you are interested in things like synchronicity, then doing art as a way of making knowledge can become very powerful. It is hugely Dionysian. Dionysus was the god of the theatre, because the theatre is where you do your dismembering and remembering. And the Jungian arts-based research is a very Dionysian dismembering of assumptions and psyche, and the research into the problem that you're looking at, and then a kind of remembering of it in a different form. And that remembering creates a new consciousness. And it's also very Jungian if we treat the artwork as a collection of psychic images that are autonomous. It's not about what the artist is trying to say. You have to let that go, and let the materialized energy of the psyche in the artwork, you know, find its own meanings. And so I've been teaching this to students. It's been very successful. And I noticed, of course, that Jungian arts-based research has existed way before that term, you know, way before anybody's called it that. I've had a number of students come to me from elsewhere saying, I've been doing this, and you've given me a language for it. And that's really, so I consider that to be really important. And I want to go on promoting it, because Jungians do have a bit of a problem about the arts because of Jung's own reservations. And they're good reservations. But I do believe that if you are not a clinician, that what an artist can do with the culture or a topic is very, you could say in some ways, is equivalent to what an analyst can do with a person.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So, for example, when I was writing a novel during the pandemic and lockdown, various unexpected things happen in the writing of the novel. And one of them was a character who'd taken too many drugs, and I didn't know what was going to happen to her. And she suddenly came out with this phrase, I am the wife of Lear and I have no name. And I thought, what? Well, I have no idea what this is, but it's come. I'm supposed to be doing Jungian arts-based research. This is the image speaking. I have to include it. So I included it in the story. And it was months later when I looked up the Lear and did my own kind of remembering, that I realized that in the play of King Lear, the wife of Lear has no name. She doesn't appear, she's dead, but she is never named in the play. And the wife of King Lear is the only person who could have stopped the world falling apart. She is the only person who could have controlled Lear. And she's not there. So this sense of the world falling apart because the powerful feminine figure is absent, that was a very kind of deep moment at the time. This is in the novel called The Sacred Well Murders, the first one to be published. So when I've been working with students, this is what happens. Synchronicities happen that prove very meaningful.
I think of the play Hamilton recently
Yes.
in Broadway,
Yes.
bringing a whole other
Mm.
dimension, more diversified
Yes.
dimension to our democracy.
The remembering in that.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, we've always known that art can be synchronistic, but it is a way of dismembering and remembering that connects us with the world, because the art goes into the world and it does its own thing, and it connects with people as they find their own meanings in it.
It feels like we're coming full circle to something you said earlier about kind of the fields that have over time become so isolated.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
a way, I think, in our modern society to start bringing them back.
Yes.
And what a beautiful way to emphasize art in that.
Mm.
And it's cross-cultural too.
Absolutely.
It's
Absolutely.
very human.
I mean, we worry about decolonizing, and this is a decolonizing, Dionysian, transdisciplinary, Jungian methodology for making connections, making meanings, finding out what's going on under the surface.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
Mm.
Kirk, do you have anything you want to add before we wrap up?
Not really. I feel like we covered a very wide range, and I feel like, Susan, you've set forth the task.
Well, there's a
how
lot
do
of
we fulfill it?
there's a lot of really creative things going on in the Jungian world, and IAJS is a way of getting to know about them. Pacifica is doing lots of creative things. You said at the beginning that I was an associate chair. That was a long time ago. I'm not a chair anymore, but the various programs are, doing amazing stuff to engage with the problems that we have today. So I'm sure you'll find lots of other people who'd like to talk to you about that.
Well, actually, I think of Eileen Serlin, who's doing some very interesting work with arts-based research and arts-based therapy with the Chinese population as well.
Yeah. I mean, my point about this Jungian arts-based research is that it's not the same as art therapy. Because art therapy has to be therapy because of that relationship with the other person. And I understand this. I know this. My sister is an art therapist. Whereas Jungian arts-based research can be about anything. It can be about your own individuation, but it can be about anything, because you have that imagination, and we do live in an interactive psychic field, and synchronicities will occur. Mm.
Yes.
Mm.
All right.
Well,
Thank you so much, Susan.
So thank you very much for having me, and good luck with the wonderful work that you're doing.
Thank you so much.
thank you. Yeah, it's been wonderfly rich to talk with
Thank
you.
Bye.
Continuing to unfold.